So, like me, you now have a nice set of maps of your site, but more importantly, you're much more familiar with what's going on around you than you were before you started. So even if you lose your maps, which hopefully you don't, you still know a lot more than you did before. So let's move on to the next bit, which is to clarify our aim for the design and how we move forward from here. So the next thing we need to do is to decide on the aim, the general aim of your design. And of course we can design many things, but in permaculture what we're trying to do is to increase the resilience of the systems that look after us. And so it's good to start with things where we may be particularly vulnerable, things like food and water and energy. And how much do you meet those on site? How much comes from off-site, perhaps even some significant distance away, and what happens when there's a disruption? So for many of us, we've been noticing with recent events over the last few years that food, suddenly there might be less food in the shops or it's more expensive and so on. And so it's good to start by thinking about things like food and water and energy. So I would pick one or all of those as your key aim for your design. And then we need to think about who we're designing for. Now that's probably in this case you, but there may be more than one of you. There may be a whole family, maybe a family, there may be that you're designing for a business or a community. And so during this process we need to do our best to make sure that everybody is heard and that we're meeting everybody's needs as best as possible given the situation. So when we're thinking about the people side of design, what we want to be doing is starting by saying, who are the people? What are their needs? What kind of lifestyle do they have? So if you're designing a garden, one thing that would be useful to know is what skills do you have? What do you do for a living? How much time do you spend on site? Things like, do you like gardening? Because permaculture isn't necessarily about growing all your own food. In fact, I would say it's not about growing all your own food, but it might be more to do with connecting more with the food system. And that may be just by supporting local food projects and so on, rather than having to do it for yourself. So what are those lifestyle questions? And there are many questions we could ask. In fact, in my book, I ask lots of questions in here relating to the people in the design, but we're trying to keep it simple here. So it's important to be aware of any limitations that people have. So that might include things like mobility, or perhaps things that are a little bit less tangible like confidence or lack of confidence. Of course, knowledge, it could be another limiting factor, not knowing how to do things, lack of money. Of course, knowledge, you can learn more things, we can gain knowledge, but we can't necessarily improve our mobility. So some of these things may be changeable and some not. And the other side of that is what resources do you have? So maybe that you have a really good network that you're connected to, people that can help you, or that you have plenty of money or lots of time to do these kind of jobs. And the other side of things, of course, is what's the time scale of your design? When we're thinking about money, there's two aspects to that. There's how much money do you have to implement a design, to pay for things to go be put onto site, and also how much money will you have in an ongoing sense to pay for the maintenance of things. And the same applies to time. How much time do you have, or the money might pay somebody else to do the implementation, and likewise the maintenance of things. And in permaculture, we're not necessarily going for ultra low maintenance, although that might be an approach that you have, but we're looking to get more out of the system than we put in. So more energy gained, perhaps in food calories, than the energy put in, that we're accumulating stocks of energy and resources through our actions on the site. Also worth thinking about the tenure of the site, so whether you own, well, even if you own, you could still lose your house, but generally when people rent, they have less ability to make a change on a site. So if you're renting, or you know that you're temporary because you're a student, you're only somewhere for a year or two, then your approach might be somewhat different from somebody who's looking, like we are here now, to have a sort of decades long investment in the site. We've been here just over 4 years, and we're looking to be here, well, as long as possible. So having observed our site, we should have more of a sense of what is possible. So when I say in permaculture, we're not necessarily aiming to grow all our own food, because for many of us it's just not practical. You know, there's a certain amount of calories and nutrients that we need every year, and most of us probably don't have enough land to do that. But many of us perhaps are not growing much food at all, or we have capacity to increase what we do. And so, say for food production, if we're looking at a vulnerability being food security, we might say that one of our functions for our design might be food production, yeah, and that gets us a function which is food production. So to clarify, so there's functions and then there's systems and elements. And to clarify, a function is something that we're trying to do, and the systems, the elements, which are the things, and the systems, the way we put these things together, like trees and shrubs and herbs into a forest garden system, for instance. They're the things, but the function is what the things are doing. And so if our function is to feed ourselves, to produce food on site, or to acquire food locally, so this might tie together as food security or greater food security, then we need to be thinking of the function, and then from that point stepping back and saying, what are the things that we can do here that would allow us to produce food? What are the food producing options that we have? And from your site observations, you will know what's realistic. You will know how deep your soil is, what kind of soil you have, how well drained it is. You know, whether you're dry or you're wet, you'll understand more about your climate, where the wind comes from, how much sun you have, what your growing season is. So do you have frost in the winter? Where does that land? What is your time in between? For some places, your growing season is relatively short. I would say in Britain it's sort of medium, I guess, because we are quite far north, 50 degrees plus. But at the same time, we do have the Gulf Stream. So there's a moderating element, and we're in Cornwall, which is southwest England, which is a little bit more mild again. And so all of those things will point to what is possible for you. So by way of an example, well, we've got fig here growing against it's not entirely south-facing wall, but it's a thermal mass. We put it here because we know it not likes some heat, and we're training it there because that's one of the best microclimates on the site, which will allow us to grow figs, which perhaps wouldn't be possible a bit more out in the open, particularly as we're up the hill. Prevailing wind comes from over there. So we're thinking about what are the different things we can do and how can we relate that to the site. So the one thing that's perhaps a little bit is a pomegranate here behind me, just there. That's a pomegranate shrub, and apparently it's hardy, but of course it's not just about being hardy, it's about whether it's possible to ripen the fruits, and we'll see. It's an experiment, it's on that edge of possible. So what we did was to say a function is food production. In fact, we had several functions. We had food, we had water, because of course water is also important. We had energy, so it's all sounding rather familiar. And because I also am a teacher, I had education. So we were thinking about things that would help with education. Included on this list are places to make videos, strangely. And these are what I would call primary functions. So they're the primary functions, and what we're writing on these lists, or what we've written on those lists, are all the ideas we have for meeting that function. So if you can think of something as a thing or a collection of things, that's not a function, that's a thing that might fulfill a function. And of course some things can fulfill more than one function. So on this list, so we've got food, and then we have a food supporting or secondary function. So the primary function is food, we want food. What do we need to do to make growing the food easier? And so these are secondary functions. So we noticed on our site, wind protection, very important. We're quite high up and we're close to the coast. Soil improvement, because the soil was pretty poor. In fact, just down here in the courtyard, it's more or less a big pile of concrete blocks that have come out of the buildings when they were converted, and just a bit of soil chucked on top. And also, where we do have more natural soil, it's very thin. And things like irrigation, it doesn't get super hot in the summer months, but we do need to water plants from time to time. And so all of these are ideas we have for meeting those functions. So you have your primary functions, and then some primary functions like food production might have supporting functions. So another thing, if you're on a slope, you might be looking at soil conservation to stop the soil washing away and so on. And what we did was that we just stuck these up on the kitchen cupboards, on the doors, in the kitchen, in order to keep them right there. So when we have ideas, we're coming in and out, it's somewhere where people can interact with them. So whoever is in your client group, if you like, whoever are the people who you need to be giving attention to and listening to, put these where everyone can interact with them, or at least make sure that there are copies of these wherever. And we left ours up for about 3 weeks, but we have a week before the next one. So you've got at least a week to decide what are your functions. Do you want to focus on just one, which is also completely fine, or do you want to have several? Are you going to be thinking about food and water and energy? In which case then each one wants to have its own sheet of paper or cardboard, as it turns out with this one. Put them up somewhere and see what comes up. And of course, not everything that you think of will emerge immediately. So it's good to leave them up for a while, in fact, on an ongoing basis. But by this time next week, you should have a nice lot of things. And I'll see you back then for the next stage of your design.